Elena Bradford smoothed the silk fabric of her emerald evening gown as she stood before the mirror in their modest two-bedroom apartment, her reflection revealing both excitement and anxiety about the dinner that would change everything. Her husband Ryan sat on their worn leather couch, scrolling through his phone in dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking entirely too casual for what she had repeatedly explained was the most important evening of her entire career. The luxury estate dinner at Ashworth Manor wasn't just another business function. It was where she would finalize the paperwork for her groundbreaking $370 million development deal with Meridian Holdings, the mysterious conglomerate that had somehow seen potential in her sustainable architecture firm when every other major investor had turned her away. Elena had spent 6 years building Bradford Designs from nothing, working 18-hour days, maxing out credit cards, and convincing skeptical clients that her vision for eco-friendly urban planning could actually transform entire neighborhoods. And now this singular moment would validate every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every time she'd chosen her drafting table over dinners with her husband. Ryan had always supported her dreams with quiet encouragement, never complaining about their modest lifestyle. Despite coming from wealth he'd walked away from years ago, never demanding she explain why she spent more time with blueprints than with him, never asking her to slow down or reconsider her relentless ambition. But tonight, watching him sit there looking like he planned to attend a backyard barbecue rather than a formal dinner with corporate executives and billionaire investors, Elena felt something sharp twist in her chest, a mixture of love and frustration, gratitude and embarrassment, because she needed him there for moral support, yet desperately worried he would somehow diminish her credibility in front of the people who controlled her future. She had worked impossibly hard to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry, to prove that a woman in her early 30s could negotiate 9-figure deals, to demonstrate that someone from a working-class background could play in the same arena as Ivy League graduates with trust funds and family connections. The guest list for tonight's dinner read like a Forbes Billionaires compilation. Tech moguls, real estate developers, venture capitalists, and the notoriously private leadership team from Meridian Holdings, who had requested this formal celebration before transferring the funds that would make her one of the youngest self-made success stories in commercial real estate development. Elena had rehearsed her talking points 100 times, memorized every detail about the sustainable mixed-use development that would revitalize the struggling waterfront district, prepared responses to potential questions about her firm's capacity to manage such an enormous project, and carefully selected this specific gown because it projected confidence without arrogance, success without ostentation. Everything had to be perfect, absolutely flawless, because opportunities like this appeared once in a lifetime, and she refused to let anything or anyone jeopardize the moment when years of struggle finally transformed into triumph. Why had Ryan not changed into something more appropriate when she'd explicitly mentioned the dress code 3 times this week? Why did he seem so unconcerned about making the right impression on people who could either open doors or slam them shut forever? How could he possibly understand what this evening meant when he'd never had to fight for recognition, never faced the condescension of older men who assumed she was someone's assistant rather than the principal architect? Never experienced the suffocating pressure of knowing that one mistake could confirm every stereotype about women lacking the toughness for high-stakes business negotiations? The drive to Ashworth Manor took 45 minutes, winding through progressively wealthier neighborhoods until they reached the private road lined with old-growth oak trees that led to the sprawling estate perched on a hillside overlooking the city's glittering skyline. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her portfolio, containing backup copies of every document she might possibly need, while Ryan drove their aging sedan with infuriating calmness, occasionally glancing at her with that gentle smile that usually melted her frustration, but tonight only amplified her anxiety. She'd tried 3 times during the drive to suggest he at least put on the sports jacket lying in the back seat, but he'd deflected each attempt with vague reassurances that everything would be fine, that she shouldn't worry so much, that these people would care more about her brilliant work than about anyone's wardrobe choices. Easy for him to say when he wasn't the one whose entire professional future hung in the balance, when his name wasn't attached to the contracts being signed tonight, when he could simply fade into the background while she performed under the scrutinizing eyes of investors who could withdraw their support at the slightest hint of instability or unprofessionalism. The circular driveway already held an impressive collection of luxury vehicles: Bentleys, Mercedes, Teslas, and several models Elena couldn't even identify, making their modest car look like a vehicle that had wandered in from the service entrance by mistake. A uniformed valet approached with professional courtesy, though Elena caught the brief flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw their automobile among the fleet of six-figure machines. She stepped out, smoothing her gown again, acutely aware that her dress, while beautiful, had come from a consignment shop rather than a designer boutique, that her jewelry was costume rather than genuine, that everything about her screamed imposter syndrome despite her legitimate achievements in the contract that proved she belonged in these circles. Ryan came around the car, still maddeningly underdressed, still radiating that quiet confidence that made no sense given the circumstances, still looking at her with pride and affection that would have been touching if she wasn't so terrified he would somehow embarrass her in front of the people who controlled her destiny. They approached the mansion's grand entrance, where lights spilled from floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing glimpses of elegantly dressed guests holding champagne flutes and engaging in the kind of sophisticated conversation that separated the powerful from the merely hopeful. Elena paused on the marble steps, turning to Ryan with desperation, finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper as she gripped his arm and made him look directly into her eyes. She told him, with all the force of her accumulated anxiety and ambition, that tonight was critically important, that these were not regular people but titans of industry who expected certain standards, that she needed him to please not do anything that might reflect poorly on her or her company, that he should maybe just stay quiet and let her handle all the conversations, that she loved him but really needed him to understand the magnitude of what was at stake and not embarrass her in any way, because this was her one chance to secure everything they'd been working toward for years. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Not hurt exactly, but perhaps sadness or understanding, or something else entirely. Before he nodded slowly and promised he would do his best, though his tone carried an odd note she couldn't quite interpret, almost like he was suppressing amusement or holding back information, which made no sense whatsoever given the gravity of the situation. The massive double doors opened before they could knock, revealing a distinguished butler who greeted them with formal politeness and gestured toward the grand foyer where other guests had gathered. Elena stepped inside, her heels clicking on imported marble, her eyes taking in the crystal chandeliers and original artwork and architectural details that represented wealth so old and established it didn't need to announce itself. Several people turned to observe the new arrivals, their expressions polite but assessing, clearly trying to place who she was and whether she mattered in their social hierarchy. She recognized a few faces from business magazines and industry conferences: Gregory Hartman, the real estate mogul who'd made billions in commercial development; Patricia Westbrook, whose venture capital firm backed half the successful startups in the region; Daniel Torres, the tech entrepreneur whose company had revolutionized sustainable building materials. These were her people now, or would be once the deal closed, and she needed to impress them, to prove she deserved a seat at their table despite coming from completely different circumstances. A server approached with a tray of champagne, and Elena accepted a glass, using the moment to scan the room for anyone from Meridian Holdings, the company whose representatives she'd only met via video conferences and whose leadership remained mysteriously private despite managing billions in investments across dozens of industries. She'd researched them obsessively but found surprisingly little information. No flashy press releases, no celebrity executives giving TED Talks, no social media presence beyond the most basic corporate website listing their various holdings without identifying the decision-makers behind them. This secrecy had initially concerned her, but their lawyers were legitimate, their funds were verified, and their interest in her sustainable development project seemed genuine. So she'd pushed her doubts aside and focused on delivering the proposal that had somehow convinced them to commit $370 million to her vision. Ryan stood beside her, and she noticed several women glancing at him with interest despite his casual attire. Because even in jeans, he carried himself with a natural charisma that drew attention. One older gentleman near the fireplace kept staring at Ryan with an odd expression, something between recognition and uncertainty, before leaning over to whisper to his companion, who immediately turned to look as well. Elena felt fresh anxiety spike through her chest. Had Ryan somehow already created a situation? Was his inappropriate dress already generating gossip among people whose opinions mattered? She was about to pull him aside when a woman in an impeccable navy suit approached with a warm smile, introducing herself as Jennifer Morrison, Director of Operations for Meridian Holdings, finally putting a face to one of the names Elena had seen on countless emails over the past 3 months. Jennifer shook Elena's hand with genuine enthusiasm, congratulating her on the phenomenal proposal and expressing how excited the entire Meridian team was about the waterfront project and its potential to set new standards for sustainable urban development. Then Jennifer turned to Ryan, her expression shifting to something Elena couldn't quite read. Was it deference, recognition, respect, before extending her hand and saying something that made absolutely no sense, welcoming him and mentioning how honored everyone was that he decided to attend tonight personally, since he usually preferred to remain behind the scenes. Ryan shook Jennifer's hand with easy familiarity, thanking her for organizing everything so beautifully, and Elena stood there completely confused, trying to understand why the Director of Operations at Meridian Holdings was treating her casually dressed husband like he was someone important, rather than just the supportive spouse of the architect they were investing in. Before Elena could ask what was happening, the butler's voice rang out across the foyer, announcing that dinner was about to be served and requesting that guests move to the formal dining room. The crowd began flowing toward an adjacent space, and Elena found herself swept along, still clutching Ryan's arm, but now with questions multiplying in her mind instead of just anxiety about his appearance. The dining room was spectacular, a table that could seat 30 beneath another crystal chandelier, place settings that probably cost more than her monthly rent, floral arrangements that looked like museum installations. She searched for name cards, hoping to find their seats somewhere respectable but not too prominent, only to feel her confusion deepen when she saw Ryan's name at the head of the table, the position traditionally reserved for the host, with her own name immediately to his right. Someone had made a mistake, obviously, because there was no conceivable reason her husband should be seated in the place of honor at a dinner hosted by Meridian Holdings to celebrate her deal. She turned to point out the error to Jennifer, but the operations director had already moved away to help other guests find their seats, all of whom kept glancing at Ryan with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that looked disturbingly like deference. Gregory Hartman approached the billionaire real estate developer, and instead of introducing himself to Elena, the architect he should be interested in meeting, he went directly to Ryan, shaking his hand warmly and saying something about how rare it was to see him at these functions and how much he'd learned from Meridian's investment strategies over the years. Ryan responded with comfortable familiarity, asking about Gregory's latest project in the financial district, displaying knowledge of deals and details he shouldn't possess unless he'd been following commercial real estate development far more closely than he'd ever mentioned. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, trying to construct a narrative that made sense of what she was witnessing. Did Ryan know these people from his past, from the wealthy family he'd walked away from before they met? Was he somehow connected to Meridian Holdings in a way he'd never disclosed? But even that didn't explain the seating arrangement or the way everyone seemed to be waiting for him, rather than focusing on her and the project that was supposedly the reason for this gathering. Patricia Westbrook arrived at the head of the table, greeting Ryan with obvious pleasure, mentioning how brilliant his team's analysis of the waterfront project had been, and how she wished more investors approached opportunities with such thorough understanding of both financial returns and social impact. His team, his analysis. Elena felt reality beginning to shift beneath her feet, pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves into a picture completely different from what she'd believed. Ryan pulled out the chair at the head of the table but didn't sit down, instead turning to face the assembled guests as conversations gradually quieted and attention focused on him. He stood there in his casual clothes, looking utterly comfortable despite being surrounded by formal evening wear, and began speaking in a voice that carried authority Elena had never heard from him before, welcoming everyone to the celebration of what he called one of the most exciting investments Meridian Holdings had made in the past decade. The words hit Elena like physical blows as understanding finally crashed through her denial. Ryan wasn't just connected to Meridian Holdings. He was Meridian Holdings, the mysterious leadership that had remained hidden behind corporate structures and legal entities, the decision-maker who had approved her $370 million deal, the person everyone in this room had actually come to see. He continued speaking, explaining how he'd founded Meridian 15 years ago with a philosophy of identifying talented people with transformative ideas and providing them resources without demanding control or credit. How he preferred operating behind the scenes because the focus should always be on the work rather than the investors. How he'd structured the company specifically to avoid the ego-driven spectacle that characterized too much of the venture capital world. Elena stood frozen beside her chair, unable to process the revelation that her husband of 5 years, the man who'd lived contentedly in their modest apartment, who'd never complained about their second-hand furniture or her obsessive work schedule, who'd driven an aging sedan without apparent concern for status symbols, was actually a billionaire who could have afforded literally anything but had chosen simplicity instead. He caught her eye as he spoke, his expression gentle and apologetic, clearly aware of the shock he was causing, but also somehow asking for understanding, for the chance to explain why he'd kept this enormous secret from the person who should have known him best. Ryan told the assembled guests that he'd made exceptions to his privacy policy tonight for 2 reasons. First, because Elena Bradford's Sustainable Development Project represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking the world desperately needed. And second, because Elena herself was his wife, though she'd been unaware of his involvement in Meridian or his role in approving her proposal, since he'd carefully kept those aspects of his life separate from their marriage. Gasps rippled through the room, and Elena felt every eye turn toward her, people reassessing her from supportive spouse to the woman who'd somehow captured the attention of one of the most successful and secretive investors in the industry. Ryan continued, his voice carrying affection now alongside the authority, explaining that he'd watched Elena build her company through pure talent and determination, that he'd been careful not to interfere or create advantages she hadn't earned herself, that he'd actually recused himself from the initial evaluation of her proposal to avoid any appearance of favoritism, and that a completely independent team had recommended the investment based solely on the project's merits before he'd even known she'd submitted it to Meridian. He described discovering her proposal in the stack of potential investments, reading through her comprehensive plans without initially realizing they were hers because she used her company name, rather than personal identification in the documentation, being genuinely impressed by the innovative approach to sustainable design before reaching the signature page and seeing the name of the woman he loved. Elena's hands shook as she tried to absorb information that contradicted everything she'd believed about her life, her marriage, her success. Because if Ryan had this kind of wealth and power, why had he let her struggle? Why had he watched her max out credit cards and stress over client payments and work herself to exhaustion when he could have written a check that solved every problem? The hurt and confusion must have shown on her face because Ryan's expression shifted to something pained, and he addressed the unspoken question directly, telling her in the room that he'd made a choice early in their relationship not to interfere with her dreams using his resources because he'd seen too many talented people lose their drive when things came too easily, because he loved her ambition and determination and refused to diminish those qualities by making her dependent on his money rather than her own abilities. He admitted it had been difficult sometimes, watching her struggle when he could have helped, but he'd believed she deserved the satisfaction of succeeding on her own terms, of knowing absolutely that her achievements were the result of her talent rather than his connections. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes, anger and relief and love and betrayal all tangled together into something too complicated to name. Ryan stepped closer, still addressing the crowd but speaking to her, explaining that he'd broken his own rules tonight by revealing himself publicly because after the conversation in the car, after hearing her ask him not to embarrass her in front of people whose approval she thought she needed, he'd realized the secret had gone too far had created a situation where she doubted herself unnecessarily, believed she had to prove her worth to strangers, when the truth was that everyone in this room had already been impressed by her work for months. He turned fully toward her now, his voice dropping to a more intimate volume, even though everyone could still hear, telling her that she'd built something remarkable without any help from him. That the $370 million investment was entirely justified by the quality of her vision and the thoroughness of her planning. That Meridian's independent evaluation team had actually recommended an even larger investment, but he'd kept the number at her original request to avoid raising questions. The room had gone completely silent, everyone watching this unexpected personal drama unfold at what was supposed to be a straightforward business dinner. Ryan reached for Elena's hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in the familiar gesture that had comforted her through countless stressful moments. Except now that simple touch carried the weight of years of hidden truth and complicated motivations that she couldn't begin to process while standing in front of 30 witnesses. Jennifer Morrison, bless her, seemed to sense the need for privacy and smoothly announced that dinner would be served in 10 minutes, giving guests time to refresh their drinks and circulate, essentially creating space for Elena and Ryan to step away from immediate scrutiny. Elena let Ryan guide her toward the mansion's terrace, her mind still reeling through implications and revelations, trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the billionaire investor who'd apparently been hiding in plain sight for their entire relationship. The cool evening air helped clear some of the fog, and she finally found her voice, asking the question that mattered most. Why? Why keep something this enormous secret? Why let her worry and struggle and doubt when he could have simply told her the truth and trusted her to handle it? Ryan leaned against the terrace railing, looking out at the city lights spread below them, and explained that he'd grown up watching wealth corrupt relationships, seeing people befriend his family for access rather than genuine connection, witnessing his own parents' marriage deteriorate under the pressure of maintaining appearances and managing complicated business empires. He'd walked away from that world in his 20s, built Meridian specifically to operate differently, and when he'd met Elena at that coffee shop where she'd been sketching building designs on napkins between client meetings, he'd fallen in love with her passion and authenticity and determination to succeed without shortcuts. He'd made a choice in that moment not to introduce the complication of his wealth, to see if they could build something real without money distorting the foundation. And then as time passed and their relationship deepened, the secret became harder to reveal because he didn't want her to feel betrayed or question everything they'd built together. Elena absorbed this, understanding the reasoning even as she grappled with the deception, because part of her recognized the gift he'd tried to give her, the certainty that her success was genuinely hers, that their marriage was based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency, that she'd become exactly who she wanted to be without his money smoothing the path or creating doubts about her capabilities. But another part of her felt the sting of not being trusted with the full truth, of being protected when she'd never asked for protection, of working herself to exhaustion, partly to prove she could provide a good life for them both, when apparently that had never been a concern. She told him this, her voice shaking slightly, but determined to be honest about the complexity of what she felt, and Ryan listened without interrupting, accepting her anger and hurt as justified consequences of his choices. The conversation that followed covered years of hidden truth in minutes, how he'd structured his life to maintain separation between his business identity and his personal life, how he'd carefully avoided situations where the two might intersect, how he'd watched her submit the proposal to Meridian through their public channels without giving any indication he owned the company, how he genuinely recused himself from the decision process until the independent team had already recommended approval. He showed her his phone, pulling up internal Meridian communications that proved his account of events, that demonstrated the investment had been approved on merit before his personal connection was even factored into the equation. Elena read through the messages, seeing her project evaluated by professionals who had no idea she was married to their boss, seeing their enthusiasm for her sustainable design approach and their confidence in her ability to execute the vision, and something tight in her chest finally loosened, because whatever else was complicated about this situation, Her work itself had earned this opportunity. They stood together on the terrace as the dinner hour approached, and Elena asked what happened now, how they moved forward from this moment of revelation that had transformed her understanding of their entire relationship. Ryan suggested they could leave if she wanted, skip the dinner and go home to talk privately, but she surprised herself by saying no. They should stay because running away felt like admitting she couldn't handle the situation, when actually she was beginning to see it differently. Yes, Ryan had kept enormous secrets, but he'd also believed in her enough to let her struggle and succeed on her own terms, had loved her enough to prioritize her independence over the easier path of simply solving her problems with money, had respected her ambition enough to risk their relationship rather than diminish her achievements. It didn't excuse the deception, but it complicated the narrative in ways that made simple anger impossible. She took his hand, the same hand she'd held through years of modest living and quiet support, except now she understood that the modesty had been a choice rather than a constraint, that the support had come from someone with resources to offer much more, but wisdom enough to recognize when less was actually more valuable. They walked back into the dining room together, and Elena felt the weight of attention, but also something else. A new kind of confidence born from knowing her success was genuinely earned, that the people in this room had gathered not because her husband bought their presence, but because her work had impressed investors who evaluated hundreds of proposals and chose hers based purely on merit. She took her seat beside Ryan at the head of the table, and as dinner service began, she found herself engaging in conversations with Gregory Hartman and Patricia Westbrook, not as a nervous newcomer desperate to prove herself, but as someone who belonged in these circles because her talent and vision had earned her place. The evening unfolded with unexpected warmth, and Elena discovered that many of the guests had fascinating stories about their own journeys, their own struggles before success, their own moments of doubt that achievement eventually conquered. Ryan participated in conversations but consistently directed attention back to Elena and her project, making it clear that despite the revelation of his identity, she remained the actual focus of the celebration, the person whose work would transform the waterfront and set new standards for sustainable development. At one point, Daniel Torres asked Elena detailed questions about her approach to incorporating green technology into commercial spaces, and she found herself explaining her philosophy with genuine passion rather than performing for approval, because she'd stopped trying to impress people who already believed in her work. As dessert was served and conversations grew more relaxed, Jennifer Morrison approached with contracts that needed final signatures, the actual paperwork that would transfer $370 million to Bradford Designs and formally launch the waterfront project. Elena read through the documents carefully, her trained eye catching every detail, and when she reached the signature line, she paused for just a moment, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this chair, this table, this moment of transformation. She signed her name with steady confidence, and the room erupted in applause, people raising glasses to toast her success and the project's potential to reshape how cities approach sustainable development. Ryan raised his glass alongside everyone else, his eyes meeting hers with pride and love, and perhaps relief that the secret was finally revealed, and she hadn't walked away from everything they'd built together, despite the complicated foundation. The drive home felt surreal, their modest sedan somehow transformed by context into a choice rather than a limitation. And Elena found herself laughing at the absurdity of having worried about embarrassing herself in front of people who'd apparently been waiting to meet the husband she'd asked not to embarrass her. Ryan laughed too, admitting he'd almost told her a dozen times but kept losing his nerve, kept finding reasons to wait just a little longer until eventually the timing became impossible and revelation inevitable. They talked through the night about what changed and what stayed the same, about whether they'd move from their small apartment or keep it because they actually loved the neighborhood, about how to navigate the complexity of their new public reality while preserving the private authenticity that had always defined their relationship. Elena decided she wanted to keep working exactly as she had before, building her company through her own effort, even if financial stress was no longer a factor, because the satisfaction of achievement mattered more than the ease of abundance. And Ryan supported this completely because it confirmed everything he'd believed about her character and values. In the weeks that followed, Elena Bradford became known not just as the architect behind the revolutionary waterfront development, but as the woman who'd earned a record-breaking investment without knowing her husband controlled the company. And somehow this story resonated with people who were tired of nepotism and connections determining success. Her firm received dozens of new inquiries from clients who wanted to work with someone whose talent spoke louder than their connections, and the waterfront project itself became a symbol of what was possible when vision met opportunity on legitimate terms. She and Ryan eventually moved into a larger home, but kept the modest apartment as well, using it as a retreat when life got too complicated or when they needed to remember who they'd been before revelation transformed their circumstances. The luxury estate dinner remained a turning point Elena reflected on often, not because it revealed her husband's wealth, but because it proved to her absolutely that her success was real, earned, deserved, and no amount of money could have purchased the satisfaction of knowing she'd achieved everything through her own remarkable talent and unshakable determination.